You are sitting in a dimly lit room. The year is 1513, and outside your window the waters of the Bosphorus shimmer quietly under the glow of oil lamps. The world, as most people understand it, is still small, fragmented, and filled with unknown edges. On the table in front of you lies a stretched piece of gazelle-skin, smoothed carefully into parchment. Your tools are simple, yet what you are about to draw will unsettle historians for centuries. With deliberate confidence, you sketch coastlines that no man of your time should be able to know. South America curves into existence with unmistakable precision. West Africa mirrors it across the Atlantic with almost perfect proportion. And then at the very bottom of the world, you draw something truly impossible. A frozen landmass that official history insists will not be discovered for another 300 years. This is the map signed by Ottoman Admiral Pyri Reis, and it is not merely a map. It is a question carved into history itself. What makes this document so disturbing is not its age, nor the identity of the man who signed it, but the knowledge it seems to contain. The Pyri Reis map does not feel like guesswork. It does not feel symbolic. It feels remembered. When the map was rediscovered in 1929 during renovations at Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, it was not found displayed proudly or preserved with ceremony. It was found rolled up, almost forgotten, tucked away among administrative documents by a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann. At first glance, it appeared to be just another early modern nautical chart, but the deeper scholars looked, the more the map resisted explanation. The parchment was dated to the Islamic year 919, corresponding to 1513 in the modern calendar, and bore the signature of Pyri Reis, a respected admiral of the Ottoman Imperial Navy. More intriguingly, the map contained handwritten notes in which Pyri Reis calmly explained his sources. He did not claim divine inspiration, speculation, or artistic imagination. Instead, he stated plainly that he had compiled a map from approximately 20 earlier charts. Some, he claimed, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. One, he said, had belonged to Christopher Columbus himself. These notes were not hidden. They were written directly onto the map, as if the admiral expected future readers to understand exactly what he was doing. At first, historians focus on the Atlantic coastlines. The proportions of South America and West Africa are remarkably accurate for the early 16th century. Longitude placement, a problem that would not be properly solved until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century, appears unerringly precise. Pyri Reis had never sailed to South America. There is no record of him even approaching those waters. Yet the coastlines sit where they should, relative to one another, as if drawn by someone with access to modern navigational data. But it is the southernmost section of the map that transforms curiosity into unease. Below South America, the map depicts a landmass that closely resembles Antarctica. Not the Antarctica we see today, buried beneath kilometers of ice, but Antarctica as it exists beneath that ice. The coastline shown corresponds not to the frozen continent's visible edge, but to the subglacial bedrock topography of Queen Maud Land. This is geography that has been hidden under ice for roughly 6,000 years. No human civilization, according to conventional history, should have been able to see it. For decades, this claim was dismissed as exaggeration or coincidence. That changed in 1960, when the United States Air Force became involved. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Zalm, a cartographer working with the Air Force, compared the Pyri Reis map to seismic data gathered during the 1949 Antarctic expeditions. These surveys had used advanced technology to map the continent's bedrock beneath the ice. The comparison produced a result no one expected. The coastline on the 16th century map matched the seismic profile with striking accuracy. Zalm documented his findings in an official report, stating openly that the data could not be reconciled with the accepted state of geographical knowledge in 1513. Further analysis followed. Experts at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the United States Navy Hydrographic Office examined the map independently. Using statistical comparison methods, they calculated a correlation coefficient of 0.98 between the Antarctic coastline on the Pyri Reis map and modern surveys. In scientific terms, that figure borders on perfection. This was no vague resemblance. It was a precise alignment. Faced with this, mainstream historians proposed a simpler explanation. The Antarctic coastline, they argued, was not Antarctica at all, but a distorted extension of South America. Early cartographers often stretched coastlines southward when unsure where land ended. According to this view, believers were selectively interpreting features that appear to match Antarctica while ignoring inaccuracies elsewhere. Piri Reis, they insisted, was merely combining Portuguese and Spanish charts from the early age of exploration, nothing more. Yet this explanation begins to collapse when the map is analyzed using period-appropriate projection mathematics. When corrected for projection style Piri Reis would have used, the southern landmass does not align with South America. River mouths, coastal indentations, and mountain placements fail to match the continent above. Instead, they correspond uncannily with Queen Maud Land beneath Antarctica's ice. This was not pattern matching by amateurs. The original analysis was conducted by military cartographers with no interest in alternative histories or ancient mysteries. They were solving a technical problem, and the data led them somewhere deeply uncomfortable. The question then becomes unavoidable. If Piri Reis did not discover Antarctica himself, and if the knowledge could not have come from 16th century exploration, where did it come from? His own notes offer a clue, but no proof. He referenced ancient source maps, some allegedly copied from originals dating back more than 2,000 years. Not one of those source charts has ever been found. They have vanished completely, leaving only fragments of their information embedded in later maps. Some researchers, most notably Charles Hapgood, suggested that the Piri Reis map was not an isolated anomaly, but a surviving copy of much older cartographic knowledge. Hapgood proposed that an advanced maritime civilization existed during the last ice age, when Antarctica's coastline was ice-free. According to this hypothesis, that civilization mapped the world with a level of accuracy we still struggle to explain, with no known connection to the Ottoman admiral, would draw a second map showing the same impossible continent beneath the ice. And this time, the details would be even harder to dismiss. 18 years after the Piri Reis map was drawn in Constantinople, another impossible image of the southern world appeared, this time in the heart of Renaissance Europe. The year was 1531. Paris was alive with intellectual ambition, and at its center worked a man whose reputation rested not on speculation, but on mathematics. His name was Orens Fine, known to scholars by his Latinese name, Orontius Phineus. He was the royal mathematician to King Francis I, a professor at the College Royal, and one of the most respected scientific minds of his generation. When Phineus published his world map, he did not present it as myth or philosophy. He presented it as measured reality. At the bottom of his map, centered precisely on the South Pole, lay an entire continent, not a vague outline, not a symbolic suggestion, but a fully formed landmass. Mountain ranges rose from its interior. Rivers flowed outward toward the sea. Bays and inlets carved the coastline with confidence. Antarctica was drawn as though the ice simply did not exist. This was not an afterthought or decorative flourish. It was rendered with the same seriousness and structural logic as Europe, Asia, and Africa. The map used a distinctive double cordiform or heart-shaped projection, a sophisticated mathematical choice that allowed Phineus to display the world with internal consistency. This mattered because Phineus was not an artist guessing at the unknown. He was a man obsessed with coordinates, proportions, and astronomical accuracy. He calculated latitude and longitude. He designed scientific instruments. He published astronomical tables used by navigators and scholars alike. His work formed part of the intellectual backbone of Renaissance science. What makes his Antarctic depiction so disturbing is not merely that it exists, but that it is measured. The continent on Phineus's map spans approximately 6,500 kilometers across. The real Antarctica measures roughly 5,500 kilometers at its widest point. For a 16th century scholar drawing what should have been a purely hypothetical landmass, that margin of error is astonishingly small. But the precision does not stop there. Phineus's map shows a massive mountain range running across the interior of the continent, dividing into eastern and western regions. This range closely corresponds to the Transantarctic Mountains, a geological feature not confirmed until the 20th century. It depicts river systems flowing from the high interior toward the coast. For centuries, Critics dismiss these rivers as fantasy. Antarctica, after all, is frozen solid. Rivers do not flow there. Yet during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958, seismic surveys revealed extensive subglacial river valleys beneath the ice, carved long before glaciation sealed the continent. The coastline itself contains bays and indentations that match bedrock features mapped by modern seismic reflection techniques. One prominent indentation aligns closely with the Ross Sea and the Ross Ice Shelf. These are not random shapes. They correspond to specific geographical structures hidden beneath kilometers of ice. For much of its existence, the Phineas map sat quietly in archives, its implications unnoticed. It was only in the 1960s, when Charles Hapgood and Captain Arlington Mallory began studying ancient cartography in light of new Antarctic data, that the map resurfaced as a serious problem. When Phineas's Antarctic continent was overlaid onto modern subglacial maps using projection mathematics appropriate to the 16th century, the alignment was deeply unsettling. Features did not simply resemble Antarctica in a general way. They occupied the correct relative positions. The standard explanation offered by historians is familiar. Ancient Greek philosophers, they argue, believe in a southern landmass called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, theorized to balance the continents of the north. Medieval and Renaissance cartographers inherited this idea and filled the southern regions of their maps with imagined continents. According to this view, Phineas was merely illustrating an old theory, decorating it with artistic mountains and rivers to complete the composition. Any resemblance to real Antarctica is coincidence, but this explanation does not sit comfortably with the facts. Phineas was not illustrating mythology. He was plotting coordinates. If he were guessing, he faced an infinite number of choices about where to place mountains, rivers, and coastlines. The probability of placing them in positions that align with real subglacial geography is vanishingly small. Guessing does not explain precision. This leads to a more troubling question. If Phineas did not invent his geography, where did he get it? He worked during a period when Renaissance scholars were actively rediscovering ancient texts preserved in monasteries, Islamic libraries, and Byzantine archives. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, a flood of Greek and Roman manuscripts entered Western Europe. Maps and geographical treatises, long forgotten, may have traveled with them. Some researchers suggest that Phineas and Pyrie Reis were drawing from the same deep reservoir of ancient cartographic knowledge. A network of source maps, copied and recopied over centuries, fragmented across cultures, yet preserving fragments of a much older global survey. Others pushed the timeline even further back, proposing that a sophisticated maritime civilization existed before the end of the last ice age, when Antarctica's coast was exposed and navigable. According to this idea, what we see in 16th century maps are not discoveries, but echoes. What is most difficult to dismiss is the pattern. Two cartographers, separated by geography, language, and political allegiance, produced maps within 2 decades of each other showing the same impossible continent in similar ways. Both claimed ancient sources. Both displayed knowledge that would not be officially confirmed for hundreds of years. Neither left behind the original materials they claimed to use. And then, 2 centuries later, another French geographer would add a detail so precise that it would not be proven correct until modern drilling pierced the Antarctic ice itself. Because the next map does not merely show Antarctica without ice. It shows Antarctica split in two. In 1737, more than 2 centuries before Antarctica would officially be discovered, a French geographer's modern seismic surveys conducted during the International Geophysical Year of 1958 revealed that Antarctica is indeed divided by the Transantarctic mountain range, and that beneath the ice sheet lies a massive channel of bedrock sitting below sea level. If the ice were removed, East and West Antarctica would form 2 distinct islands. This discovery was later confirmed in detail by comprehensive projects such as BedMap 2, published in 2013, which mapped Antarctica's subglacial topography with unprecedented precision. Boach's 1737 map does not vaguely suggest division. It shows a specific channel in a specific location. The alignment matches the real subglacial geography far too closely to be explained by chance. If Boach were guessing, He could have placed a channel anywhere, yet he placed it exactly where modern science would later find it. Like Pyre Reis and Orontius Phineas before him, Boach claimed ancient sources. In 18th century academic French, this was not a casual phrase. It referred to genuine historical documents, earlier charts, inherited geographical records. Yet Boach never specified which sources he used, and none have survived. Once again, the knowledge remains, but the evidence of its origin has vanished. The standard explanation offered by historians is that Boach made an educated guess based on symmetry. If the Arctic had complex geography, perhaps the Antarctic did too. Maybe reports from southern voyages, distant sightings of ice, and theoretical reasoning combined into a lucky prediction. But luck does not explain precision. Educated guesses do not land on exact subglacial realities more than 2 centuries in advance. By now, a pattern is impossible to ignore. Across centuries, across empires, across political and cultural divides, cartographers keep producing fragments of knowledge that appear far too early. They claim ancient sources. Those sources are never found. The maps are dismissed, forgotten, or explained away until modern technology quietly proves them right. And Antarctica is only one part of this story. Because while some maps reveal knowledge buried beneath ice, others describe lands that were supposedly unreachable at the time they were drawn. In 1569, a man whose name would become synonymous with modern navigation would draw the top of the world in a way that no one has ever been able to fully explain. Gerardus Mercator. Mercator was not merely a map maker. He was a mathematician, a geographer, and inventor of the projection system still used by GPS and maritime navigation today. His 1569 world map changed how humanity navigates the planet. But hidden within that map is a polar inset titled description of the northern lands. And what it shows should not exist. At the North Pole, Mercator did not draw an endless field of ice. He drew an open sea surrounding a massive black rock. From this central sea flowed 4 great rivers, dividing the Arctic into 4 large islands arranged in near-perfect symmetry. At the center stood Rupi's Niagara, the Black Rock, described as a powerful magnetic mountain influencing compass needles across the world. Mercator had never been there. No European expedition had reached the pole, yet the map presents this geography with calm authority, as though copied rather than imagined. Mercator even cited his source, a lost 14th century text known as Inventio Fortunata, supposedly written by an English monk who had traveled to the far north. Multiple medieval scholars reference this text. Not a single copy survives. Once again, the explanation is simple. Historians say, medieval symbolism, cosmology, the 4 rivers of Eden, the world mountain connecting heaven and earth. Mercator, despite his genius, was still a man of his time. When faced with the unknown, he filled the void with legend. But Mercator did not treat legend lightly in his other work. He distinguished clearly between myth and measurement. He was deeply engaged in the scientific study of magnetism and compass variation. Why would such a man confidently depict Arctic geography, citing a specific source, unless that source contained information he found credible? Even more unsettling, modern submarine studies of the Arctic basin reveal a deep central basin surrounded by submarine ridges. Not a magnetic mountain, perhaps, but a structure that faintly echoes what Mercator drew. Once again, the map is not correct in a literal sense, but it is disturbingly close. From the frozen north, the trail of impossible knowledge leads south and east, across continents and oceans, to a place no Ottoman ship ever sailed. And yet, in 1559, an Ottoman cartographer somehow drew the Pacific Ocean, as though he had seen it himself. And this time, the mystery deepens even further. The trail of impossible maps does not end in the polar regions. In fact, it leads to an ocean so vast that even Europe's greatest explorers feared it. The Pacific. For most of the 16th century, this ocean was a wall of uncertainty. European ships entered it blindly, lost fleets within it, and returned with incomplete, distorted charts. Longitude was unsolved. Distances were guessed. Entire coastlines drifted across maps from one edition to the next. And yet, in 1559, an Ottoman cartographer, produce a map of the Pacific that should not have been possible. His name was Ahmed. Very little is known about his life, which in itself is telling. He worked somewhere within the Ottoman Empire, an empire whose naval power dominated the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Red Sea, but had absolutely no presence in the Pacific Ocean. No Ottoman fleet crossed it. No Ottoman expedition explored its islands. European powers themselves had barely begun to understand it. And yet, Ahmed drew it with unsettling confidence. The Ahmed World Map, created in 1559 and preserved in the Topkapi Palace Library alongside the Piri Reis map, shows a Pacific basin with extraordinary detail. The western coast of the Americas appears from Alaska down through California and into South America. The eastern shores of China and Japan are rendered with surprising accuracy. Islands scatter across the ocean in positions that broadly reflect reality. This alone would be impressive. What makes the map deeply troubling is its precision. The coastlines are not simply recognizable. They are positioned correctly relative to one another. Longitude, the greatest unsolved navigational problem of the era, appears almost modern. So, how did Ahmed know where to place them? The standard explanation relies on espionage and trade. The Ottoman Empire, historians argue, maintained sophisticated intelligence networks. Captured sailors were interrogated. Stolen Portuguese and Spanish charts circulated secretly despite state efforts to suppress them. Bits of information from many sources could have been combined into a composite map. Any apparent accuracy, they argue, is exaggerated by selective analysis. But this explanation breaks down under scrutiny. Portuguese and Spanish Pacific charts from the mid-16th century were crude. Longitude errors were massive. Even maps produced by sailors who had physically crossed the Pacific were wildly inaccurate. Ahmed's map performs better than the explorer's own charts. That should not be possible. Without an accurate method for determining longitude, coastlines cannot be positioned correctly relative to one another. You can draw a coastline. You cannot place it precisely on a global scale. Yet Ahmed did. He positioned Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands in spatial relationships that would not be reliably solved until the age of chronometers. This raises a deeply uncomfortable possibility. Ahmed may not have been copying contemporary European charts at all. He may have been copying something much older. Some researchers suggest Chinese maritime knowledge as a possible source. Admiral Zheng, his treasure fleet voyages between 1405 and 1433 reached Southeast Asia, India, and East Africa. While there is no direct evidence that these fleets crossed the Pacific, Chinese cartographic traditions were advanced, and knowledge traveled along Silk Road trade networks for centuries. Could fragments of Pacific charts have reached the Islamic world long before Europeans understood the ocean? Others point to Polynesian navigation. Polynesians crossed the Pacific using stars, swells, birds, and memory, maintaining mental maps of the ocean on a continental scale. If even a fraction of this knowledge had been recorded and transmitted westward, it could explain elements of Ahmed's map, but no such charts have survived. The most provocative suggestion mirrors what we have already seen with Antarctica, that ancient maritime cultures mapped the world far earlier than we assume, and that fragments of their knowledge survived in unexpected places. Ottoman archives, after all, inherited centuries of Islamic scholarship, which itself absorbed Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, and possibly far older traditions. Ahmed left no detailed notes explaining his sources. Once again, the map survives, but the origin of its knowledge does not. And once again, the accuracy is dismissed until compared with modern data. From the Pacific, the trail of impossible maps leads not to exploration, but to theft. Because sometimes the most revealing evidence of forbidden knowledge is not what was published openly, but what powerful empires tried desperately to keep secret. And in October 1502, in Lisbon, one man risked execution to steal exactly that kind of knowledge. October 1502, Lisbon, Portugal. The docks are quiet, but behind the walls of the royal palace, information more valuable than gold is being guarded under threat of death. Maps are not academic curiosities here. They are weapons. Whoever controls them controls trade routes, colonies, and empires. This is why Alberto Cantino is terrified. Cantino is not a navigator. He is a spy, working for the Duke of Ferrara. His mission is simple and suicidal at the same time: steal Portugal's most closely guarded cartographic secret. For months, he bribes, waits, and observes. Portuguese pilots are sworn to secrecy. Charts are locked away. Leaking navigation data is punishable by execution. And yet, somehow, Cantino succeeds. What he smuggles out of Lisbon is now known as the Cantino planisphere. Created in 1502 by anonymous Portuguese cartographers, this map should not exist in public hands. It reveals the full scope of Portuguese geographical knowledge only 2 years after the official discovery of Brazil. And what it shows raises immediate questions. The Brazilian coastline stretches for thousands of kilometers, drawn with a level of detail that implies far more exploration than the historical record admits. Official Portuguese voyages had only reached roughly 28 degrees south by 1502, yet the map shows the coast extending far beyond that point, almost at the latitude of modern Uruguay. Who mapped the rest? And when Africa is rendered from the Mediterranean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and up the east coast with striking accuracy. This reflects Vasco da Gama's voyage from 1497 to 1499, but the precision exceeds what was publicly documented. India, Sri Lanka, and the Indian Ocean coastline appear with proportions that would normally require decades of accumulated surveys. Longitude placement, once again, appears far too confident for an era without chronometers. Most revealing of all is the clear depiction of the Treaty of Tordesillas line, dividing the world between Spain and Portugal. This map is not simply descriptive. It is strategic. It shows territorial claims, navigational dominance, and geopolitical intent. It is a classified snapshot of an empire's hidden reach. When King Manuel I learned that the map had been stolen, his reaction was furious. This was not irritation over a minor leak. It was rage. And that reaction forces a simple question. If the map merely showed 2 years of Brazilian exploration, why was it worth killing to protect? The mainstream explanation insists the Cantino planisphere represents cutting-edge Portuguese exploration, rapidly compiled from pilot reports and secret voyages. Portugal, historians argue, explored aggressively and documented privately. The accuracy reflects intense effort, not impossible knowledge. But this explanation strains credibility. Even intensive exploration does not solve longitude. Even secret voyages do not explain coastlines mapped before they were officially reached. This opens another possibility, that Portuguese navigators possessed older charts before they ever sailed these waters. Charts inherited, copied, and guarded because they offer a head start in the race for empire. Phoenician, Roman, or Arab maritime knowledge could have filtered into Iberian hands through centuries of Mediterranean trade. Or Portugal may have reached Brazil before Cabral and suppressed the discovery for political advantage. The Cantino planisphere suggests something deeply unsettling. That Europe's age of discovery was built not only on courage and exploration, but on secrets, stolen knowledge, and maps that already knew where to go. And the Cantino map is not the only document to reveal knowledge that appears too early. 5 years later, in a quiet German town, South America appears clearly separated from Asia. This alone was controversial. Most Europeans still believe the lands Columbus reached were part of Asia. Wald C. Muller disagreed. And then he went further. He drew a vast ocean west of the Americas, a massive body of water separating the New World from Asia, the Pacific Ocean. This was 6 years before Vasco Núñez de Balboa would officially sight the Pacific in 1513. 14 years before Magellan would cross it. And yet, there it is, occupying space with proportions that are disturbingly close to reality. This was not a narrow decorative gap. It was a statement. A declaration that an entire ocean existed where no European had yet seen one. Wald C. Muller cited Amerigo Vespucci's letters and the ancient geographer Ptolemy as his sources. But neither described a western ocean of this scale. Vespucci hinted at a new continent, not a second ocean. Ptolemy had no knowledge of the Americas at all. So where did the idea come from? The standard explanation, claims Wald C. Muller, was reasoning logically. The Earth was known to be round. If a new continent existed, then logically another ocean must separate it from Asia. The Pacific on the map, critics say, is hypothetical space filling, not knowledge. But this explanation collapses under one uncomfortable detail. In later editions of his map, Wald-C. Muller removed the name America and altered the depiction of the Western Ocean. Why retract the correct idea? Something changed between 1507 and 1513. Something made Wald-C. Muller cautious. Some researchers believe he was pressured. Others believe new information emerged that conflicted with what he had published. Either way, the retraction suggests he knew more than he was willing to defend publicly. From stolen Portuguese secrets to retracted German revelations, the pattern continues. Knowledge appears too early, briefly surfaces, and is then hidden, dismissed, or forgotten. And this pattern does not belong to Europe alone. Because decades before Wald-C. Muller ever touched a printing block, scholars on the other side of the world were quietly compiling a map that proves advanced cartographic knowledge was not a European monopoly at all. And that map forces us to confront a global legacy far older than the Age of Discovery. In the year 1402, more than a century before Columbus set sail, scholars in a royal court far from Europe were already drawing a world that Europeans believed did not yet exist. The place was Joseon-era Korea. The map was known as the Kangnido, officially titled Anogangi Yakti Gukdo Jidu. It was created by royal scholars Iho and Gwongun, working under King Taejong. Their task was not exploration. It was synthesis. Korea had never sent ships to Africa. Korean sailors had never rounded the Cape of Good Hope. No Korean had met a European explorer. And yet, on the Kangnido map, Africa appears with a shape that would take European cartographers another century to approach. The continent stretches north to south with correct tapering toward the south. Its proportions are recognizably real. Europe, too, appears on the map. The Mediterranean basin is shown with surprising coherence. The Middle East and Arabia are clearly delineated. India and Southeast Asia are present in forms that reflect genuine geographical understanding rather than myth. This is not guesswork drawn in ignorance. It is a compilation of knowledge. The preface of the Kangnido map states clearly that it was compiled from Chinese, Korean, and Islamic sources. That explanation sounds reasonable until one problem emerges. Islamic maps of the early 15th century do not depict Africa with this level of accuracy. They show northern Africa well, but distort the southern regions badly. Chinese maps of the period are even less accurate beyond East Asia. And yet, the Kangnido map improves upon both. This raises an uncomfortable question. How did Korean scholars, working entirely from secondary sources, produce a more accurate depiction of Africa than the cultures that supposedly provided those sources? One possibility is transmission through the Silk Road, not just of goods, but of old knowledge. Roman coins have been found in India and Southeast Asia. Roman traders reached deep into the Indian Ocean. Ancient Greek texts were preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars. Chinese courts collected foreign manuscripts for centuries. It is possible that fragments of ancient Mediterranean cartography survive in Asian archives long after they vanished from Europe. Another possibility is even more unsettling, that ancient maritime exploration reached far beyond what survives in official history. Phoenician sailors are reported by Herodotus to have circumnavigated Africa around 600 BCE. If true, such a voyage would require mapping. Those maps could have survived in copies, translated, retranslated, and slowly absorbed into distant scholarly traditions. The Kangnido does not stand alone. It is evidence that sophisticated global geographical knowledge existed outside Europe long, before the so-called Age of Discovery. It suggests that the world was known in fragments, scattered across cultures, rather than revealed in a single linear progression. And if that knowledge could survive in Korea, it could survive anywhere. In 1558, in Venice, one man claimed to have uncovered such a fragment in his own family archives. What he published would divide scholars for centuries. His name was Niccolo Zeno the Younger. Zeno presented a map and a series of letters, allegedly written by his ancestors Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, describing a voyage to the far North Atlantic in the 1390s, a full century before Columbus. The map showed Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands with unusual clarity. It also showed mysterious lands to the west, labeled as Stodeland and Frisland. Frisland does not exist. And that fact has haunted the Zeno map ever since. Many historians dismiss the entire document as a 16th century hoax, fabricated to glorify the Zeno family. The Phantom Island of Friesland, they argue, proves it. But this explanation encounters problems of its own. Despite its flaws, the Zeno map was taken seriously by the greatest cartographers of the era. Gerardus Mercator included Friesland on his maps. So did Abraham Ortelius. These men were competitors with reputations at stake. They did not incorporate information lightly. Even more troubling are the accurate details. The Greenland coastline on the Zeno map contains features not shown on other European maps of time, and the descriptions of Estodolin describe a land with European-style buildings, Latin books, and a temperate climate. Circulated quietly for centuries before Columbus, not officially recognized, not celebrated, but remembered. And that brings us back to the Mediterranean, to a monk working in a Venetian monastery, creating one of the most detailed maps of the 15th century. A map so dense with annotations that it reads like a confession, because this map does not hint at ancient knowledge. It openly claims it. Around the year 1450, on a small island monastery near Venice, a man named Fermaro was quietly assembling a map that would trouble historians long after his death. Fermaro was a Camaldolese monk, but he was also a professional cartographer whose workshop served merchants, nobles, and kings. His world map was enormous, nearly 2 meters in diameter, filled with more than 3,000 annotations. But its most unsettling feature was not its size or detail. It was orientation. Fermaro placed south at the top and north at the bottom, not as a mistake, not as artistic rebellion, but because, as his annotations explain, many of his sources describe the world that way. Arabic texts, ancient Roman accounts, Eastern travel records. The map was not designed to flatter European assumptions. It was designed to preserve information as faithfully as possible. The Fermaro map depicts Africa, extending fully around its southern tip. Decades before Bartolome Dias, is officially credited with rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. It shows the Indian Ocean as an open body of water, not a closed sea as classical European tradition insisted. India, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and the Indonesian archipelago appear with proportions and placements that suggest genuine navigational knowledge. Most explosive of all is a single annotation buried among thousands. Fermaro states that a European ship, sailed around Africa's southern end in the year 1420, 68 years before Dias. He does not present this as rumor. He records it as information received from reliable sources. Fermaro's map was commissioned by King Afonso V of Portugal. That detail matters. Portugal was actively exploring the African coast at the time. They wanted the best geographical intelligence available. Fermaro was not producing a decorative object. He was producing strategic knowledge. The mainstream explanation attempts to soften the impact. Fermaro, historians argue, was compiling hearsay from merchants and travelers. The 1420 voyage may refer to partial exploration or misunderstanding. The map's accuracy reflects Venice's position as a global trade hub, not ancient secrets. But Fermaro was unusually careful with sources. His annotations distinguish clearly between certainty and speculation, and the claim of African circumnavigation is oddly specific. A date, a route, a European ship. If it were false, why include it? And if it were Portuguese propaganda, why would a Venetian monk, working for a rival maritime power, record it all? When Portuguese explorers finally rounded the Cape decades later, they reported encountering stone markers along the coast, suggesting prior voyages. Roman coins have been found far from the Mediterranean. Phoenician sailors were reported by ancient historians to have circumnavigated Africa more than 2,000 years earlier. Knowledge does not vanish cleanly. It fades, fragments, and survives in places history later forgets to look. By the time Fermaro died in 1464, his map had already become one of the most detailed geographical documents in existence. And yet, within decades, Europe would rewrite the story. The age of discovery would begin. Maps would be redrawn. Credit would be reassigned. Earlier knowledge would be framed as myth, coincidence, or error. but the maps themselves refused to cooperate. From Pyri Reis to Orontius Phineas, from Boach to Mercator, from Ahmed to Cantino, from Wald C. Muller to Korean scholars and Venetian monks. Across continents and centuries, the same pattern emerges. Cartographers claim ancient sources. They draw coastlines that should be invisible. They place oceans before they are officially seen. They predict geography confirmed only by satellites and seismic drilling. These are not isolated accidents. They are echoes of a world known before it was supposedly discovered. If history were a straight line, these maps would not exist. If progress moved cleanly from ignorance to knowledge, these documents would be impossible. And yet, they are real. They survive in libraries, archives, and museums, quietly contradicting the story we are taught. The uncomfortable conclusion is not that ancient people were more advanced than we are. It is something subtler and more difficult to accept. That knowledge can be lost. That civilizations rise, fall, and take their maps with them. That what we call discovery may often be rediscovery, and what we call myth may be memory stripped of context. The world may have been mapped long before we remember mapping it. And if that is true, then the greatest mystery is not how these maps were made. It is why the knowledge they preserved disappeared at all. Once we accept that advanced geographical knowledge may have existed earlier than officially acknowledged, a deeper and more unsettling question emerges. If this knowledge once existed, why did it vanish? Civilizations do not simply forget the shape of the world by accident. Knowledge is lost when it becomes inconvenient, dangerous, or controlled. Throughout history, maps have never been neutral objects. They are instruments of power. To map territory is to claim it. To possess routes is to dominate trade. To know the world before others do is to control the future. This is why cartographic knowledge has so often been restricted, classified, and destroyed. In ancient Alexandria, the greatest library the world had ever known held thousands of geographical and scientific texts. Works by Eratosthenes, who calculated Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. By Hipparchus, who developed longitude concepts. By Marinus of Tyre, whose lost world maps influenced Ptolemy centuries later. When the Library of Alexandria burned, knowledge was not just lost, it was fragmented, copied partially, quoted indirectly, preserved unevenly across cultures that historians would later treat as disconnected. Islamic scholars inherited Greek science, expanded upon it, corrected it, and preserved it during Europe's intellectual collapse after Rome. Their maps, star charts, and navigational texts traveled across North Africa, the Middle East, and into Asia. Later, as Europe reemerged, it quietly absorbed this knowledge while reframing it as rediscovery rather than inheritance. But inheritance alone does not explain the story. By the 15th century, Europe was not simply exploring. It was competing. Spain and Portugal were carving the world between them with papal approval. Knowledge had economic value measured in empires. Any suggestion that lands were known earlier weakened claims of divine right and heroic discovery. So earlier knowledge was minimized. Alternative explanations were dismissed. Credit was consolidated. Cartographers walked a careful line. Many of them openly referenced ancient sources, but rarely named them. Others encoded information symbolically, embedding accurate coastlines inside decorative frames of monsters and myths. Plausible deniability was protection. Pyri Reis himself acknowledged this tension. In his notes, he states clearly that some of his source maps were extremely old, but he also admits he does not fully understand them. Knowledge had survived, but meaning had eroded. The map was inherited without the story of how it was made. This pattern repeats everywhere we look. In the Americas, indigenous oral traditions describe coastlines swallowed by the sea. In Australia, Aboriginal songlines preserve geographical information tens of thousands of years old. In India, ancient texts describe cities lost beneath the ocean. These accounts are dismissed as myth until archaeology accidentally confirms them. Modern science has begun to catch up with ancient memory. Underwater surveys have revealed submerged landscapes once above sea level during the last ice age. Coastlines were dramatically different just 12,000 years ago. Entire regions where humans lived are now drowned continental shelves. If mapping occurred then, those maps would describe a world that no longer exists. That possibility reframes everything. If ancient cartographers mapped coastlines before sea levels rose, their maps would appear wrong for thousands of years. Then, suddenly, satellite imagery would make them look impossibly accurate again. Not prophetic, not magical, just old. The resistance to this idea is not scientific. It is psychological. It challenges a comforting narrative of linear progress. It suggests that humanity may have reached high levels of organization before, only to fall back into fragmentation. That we are not unique. That we are repeating a cycle. And cycles do not flatter modern pride. This is why these maps provoke such strong reactions. Accepting them requires humility. It requires admitting that our version of history may be incomplete, not false, but edited. The age of discovery may not mark the moment humans first understood the world. It may mark the moment we remembered it again. And that raises one final, unavoidable question. If knowledge was lost once before, what are we losing now? Because future historians may one day look at our data gaps, our erased archives, our corrupted files, and our vanished records, and ask the same thing we're asking today. How did they know so much? And then forget it all? In the modern world, we like to believe that knowledge is permanent, digitized, backed up, stored across servers and satellites. We assume that nothing truly disappears anymore. But history suggests the opposite. The more complex a system becomes, the more fragile it often is. Much of what we know about ancient maps survives not because they were preserved deliberately, but because they were overlooked, stored in monasteries, filed incorrectly, copied by people who did not fully understand what they were copying. Survival through neglect rather than protection. Today, knowledge is curated, filtered, ranked. Algorithms decide what is visible and what is buried. Academic funding shapes which questions are acceptable to ask. Research that challenges established frameworks often struggles for legitimacy, not because it lacks evidence, but because it lacks institutional comfort. This does not require conspiracy. It only requires inertia. Once a narrative becomes dominant, alternatives are framed as fringe. Maps that do not fit the accepted timeline are labeled decorative, symbolic, or mistaken. Their anomalies are explained away individually, never collectively, because viewed together, they form a pattern that is harder to dismiss. Take Antarctica. For decades, claims about ice-free coastlines were ridiculed. Then radar imaging revealed subglacial landscapes beneath kilometers of ice, river channels, mountain ranges, coastlines buried, not erased. The maps were not impossible. They were simply inconvenient. Or consider ancient longitude. We are taught that accurate longitude measurement was impossible before the 18th century. And yet, map after map places distant lands with longitudinal confidence that should not exist. Each example is explained away as luck, but luck does not repeat this consistently across cultures and centuries. Modern archaeology has begun to confirm what maps hinted at first. Underwater cities off the coast of India, submerged stone structures near Japan. Human occupation dates push further back with every new discovery. History is expanding, not contracting. And yet, our narratives lag behind our evidence. The reason is not malice. It is structure. Institutions are slow to change. Textbooks are conservative. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But sometimes, extraordinary evidence already exists, quietly waiting to be taken seriously. Ancient maps sit at the intersection of disciplines: geography, history, archaeology, astronomy, navigation. No single field claims ownership of them, and so responsibility is diluted. Each discipline examines only the part that fits its comfort zone. This is how inconvenient knowledge survives without being integrated. But the maps persist. They continue to surface, to be re-examined, to align more closely with reality as technology improves. Satellite imagery has not embarrassed ancient cartographers. It has, in many cases, vindicated them. This forces us to reconsider a fundamental assumption, that progress is always forward, that civilization only accumulates knowledge, that we stand at the peak of understanding, looking back at ignorance. History does not support this view. History suggests fluctuation, advancement followed by collapse, memory followed by forgetting, survivors carrying fragments forward, unaware of their original context. Maps are among the most revealing of these fragments because they describe reality directly. They either match the world or they do not. And increasingly, the world is matching them, which leads to a quiet but profound shift in each rediscovered chart, each fragment of parchment. Each faded coastline is like a voice carried forward through time, whispering the same message in different languages. We saw more than you think. What makes this so difficult to accept is not the possibility that ancient people were clever. We already know they were. They built monuments aligned with the stars, engineered cities without modern machinery, and navigated oceans in vessels made of wood and rope. The real discomfort comes from the scale of the knowledge implied. These maps do not suggest minor local expertise. They suggest global awareness. They hint at coordinated systems of measurement, at methods of determining latitude and possibly even longitude with surprising accuracy, long before the marine chronometer officially solved that problem in the 18th century. And if that is true, then we are forced into a far more profound realization. Sophisticated knowledge may not move forward in a straight, ever-rising line. It may flicker. It may surge, collapse, and rise again in new forms, carried by survivors who no longer fully understand what they have inherited. Civilizations may not just rise and fall in terms of politics and architecture. They may rise and fall in knowledge itself. That idea changes the way we see the past. Instead of a dim, primitive world slowly brightening into modernity, we begin to see a landscape of lost peaks, high points of understanding that disappeared, leaving only scattered traces behind. A map copied in a medieval port city, a legend preserved in a monastery, a coastline drawn with eerie confidence on a scrap of skin or paper. These are not just historical artifacts. They are the surviving edges of something larger, something mostly erased. And here is where the story takes another unexpected turn. Because the more researchers compare these ancient maps with modern data, the more they notice that some of the most puzzling details are not errors at all. They are distortions that make sense only when you account for the tools and projections being used. What looks wrong at first glance often turns out to be a different mathematical approach to representing a curved world on a flat surface. In other words, the mapmakers were not guessing wildly. They were working within systems that may themselves have been inherited. Imagine what that means for a moment. Somewhere in the distant past, knowledge of the world's shape, size, and geography may have been organized, recorded, and transmitted with enough precision to echo thousands of years later. Not perfectly, not completely, but clearly enough that we can still see the outline of it today, like the faint impression of a fossil pressed into stone. This is where the emotional weight of the story begins to settle in, because it is no longer just about maps. It is about memory, collective memory. The memory of a species that has walked this planet for far longer than our written histories cover. We know that humans like us have existed for at least 200,000 years. Recorded history, by contrast, covers only a tiny fraction of that time. The rest is a vast, mostly silent expanse. We tend to fill that silence with assumptions of simplicity. But what if silence does not mean absence? What if it means loss? Loss can happen in many ways. A coastline city swallowed by rising seas. A network of trade routes shattered by climate change. A knowledge tradition carried by a small group, wiped out by disease, conflict, or famine. Libraries burn. Empires fall. Languages vanish. And with them goes context, the framework needed to understand the fragments that survive. A map might be copied because it is beautiful or useful, long after the techniques behind it are forgotten. Over generations, it becomes a mystery, then a legend, and finally an anomaly. This would explain why so many of these ancient charts appear out of place, as if they arrived fully formed in eras that were not ready to produce them. They may not have originated there at all. They may be echoes, copies of copies of copies, each step adding small errors, small reinterpretations, until only the core shapes remain recognizable. And still, those shapes are enough to make us pause. Because if even a fraction of this is true, then the human story is not just longer than we thought. It is deeper, more layered, more fragile. Progress becomes something that must be maintained, protected, and passed on carefully, not something guaranteed to continue automatically. Knowledge becomes something that can slip through our fingers far more easily than we like to believe. There's a quiet warning in that realization, not a dramatic prophecy, not a prediction of doom, but a gentle reminder written across centuries of parchment. What we know today is not indestructible. Our satellites, our digital archives, our global networks feel permanent, but so did the great libraries of the ancient world, and so did the trade systems and learning centers that once connected continents in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. The ancient mapmakers, whoever they truly were and whatever sources they drew from, may never have imagined that their work would one day challenge the confidence of a technological civilization thousands of years in the future. Yet here we are, staring at their lines and coastlines, realizing that the past is not as simple as we were taught. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Not that there was a lost supercivilization or secret technologies beyond our comprehension, but that human capability has always been broader than the narrow slice of history we tend to focus on. Curiosity, observation, and ingenuity did not suddenly appear in the modern era. They are ancient traits, timeless ones. When we look at these maps with humility rather than dismissal, we begin to see them not as threats to our understanding, but as invitations. Invitations to ask better questions. Invitations to re-examine assumptions. Invitations to imagine a past that was dynamic, experimental, and sometimes astonishingly perceptive about the world it inhabited. And as that perspective settles in, another thought naturally follows, one that lingers long after the details of coastlines and coordinates fade. If knowledge has been lost before and rediscovered in fragments, then we too are part of that same cycle. We are not standing at the end of history, looking back at a straight road. We are standing on one of many temporary plateaus, surrounded by traces of earlier heights and unaware of how future generations might one day interpret the fragments we leave behind. Somewhere, centuries from now, a piece of our world may survive in isolation, a data file without context, a diagram without explanation, a map whose projection no one fully understands. And just like us, they may look at it and wonder how we knew what we knew. That is a quiet bridge between their time and ours, and between ours and the deep past. A shared human experience of discovery, loss, and rediscovery. The maps endure not because they are perfect, but because they are persistent. Because even when understanding fades, curiosity returns. And curiosity, more than any single technology, it does not just drive discovery. It also drives preservation. Every time a map was copied by hand, every time a scholar chose to redraw an old coastline instead of discarding it as outdated, every time a navigator carried an inherited chart onto uncertain waters, someone made a quiet decision that the past was worth keeping. That choice, repeated across generations, is one of the reasons these mysteries can still reach us at all. Because think about how easily they could have vanished. A single dam storeroom, a careless fire, a war that sweeps through a city and turns archives into ash. History is not a solid structure. It is a fragile chain of survival. Most of what was ever written, drawn, carved, or recorded by ancient people is gone forever. What remains is not a complete library of the past. It is a handful of rescued pages. And yet, even within those few surviving pages, we find hints that the human story may be more complex than the clean timelines in textbooks suggest. This is why the maps matter so much. They are not just technical diagrams. They are survivors. They made it through collapses, migrations, plagues, and conquests. They crossed languages and belief systems. They were copied by people who may not have fully understood what they were preserving, but sensed it was important. In a way, they are messages carried in bottles across the ocean of time, and we are the ones finally opening them. When modern researchers analyze these charts, they do not just look at coastlines. They study ink composition, parchment age, copying styles, marginal notes, and the layers of revision that build up over centuries. What they often find is a history of transmission that is far older than the document itself. A 15th century map may contain details drawn from a source centuries earlier, which in turn may trace back to knowledge passed down in ways we can no longer fully reconstruct. And this layered inheritance forces us to confront a humbling truth. We do not know everything about our own past. For all our satellites and scanning technologies, there are still gaps so wide that entire chapters of human experience may lie beyond our current view. The idea is unsettling, but it is also strangely exciting because it means the story of humanity is not finished. It is still being uncovered. Notice how often major discoveries about the past begin with something small: a fragment of pottery, a buried foundation, a text reused as binding in a later book, or, in this case, a map that seems slightly too accurate in a place it should not be. At first, these details look like curiosities. Then patterns begin to form. Questions multiply. Assumptions loosen. Slowly, the picture shifts. And that shift is not just academic. It changes how we see ourselves. For a long time, modern society has told a story of inevitable progress, a steady climb from ignorance to enlightenment. But the deeper we dig into archaeology, climate history, and ancient technology, the more we see cycles instead of straight lines. Periods of innovation followed by regression. Networks that flourish, then fracture. Skills that spread, then disappear. The maps fit neatly into this broader pattern. They are not anomalies in isolation. They are part of a wider reminder that complexity in human history has appeared more than once. That does not mean ancient people had satellites or digital computers. It means they observed, measured, traveled, and shared information with a level of dedication we are only beginning to fully appreciate. They worked with the tools they had, but they worked systematically. They compared notes. They refined estimates. They passed knowledge along trade routes that stretched across deserts and seas. Over time, those accumulated observations could produce surprisingly sophisticated results. And when those systems broke down, the knowledge did not always vanish overnight. It lingered in partial form: a route remembered, a coordinate approximated, a coastline sketched from an older source. Each generation inherited fragments, sometimes without realizing how old those fragments truly were. This is why the maps feel so haunting. They are not clean windows into a lost golden age. They are smudged mirrors, reflecting a past that is both familiar and unreachable. We can see outlines, but not the full scene. We can trace lines, but not always the hands that first drew them. Yet even that partial view is powerful, because it challenges one of our deepest assumptions, that we stand at the peak of a simple, linear ascent. Instead, we begin to see ourselves as participants in a much longer relay. We are both beneficiaries and caretakers of knowledge that stretches back further than our records and forward into a future we will never see. That perspective changes the meaning of preservation in our own time. Digital storage feels permanent, but it depends on fragile infrastructures: electricity, servers, maintenance, stable societies. If those falter, our vast libraries could become as inaccessible as clay tablets buried under sand. The past shows us that loss is not a rare accident. It is a recurring part of the human story. And that is where the ancient maps offer something more than mystery. They offer perspective. They remind us that intelligence is not the exclusive property of the present, that careful observation of the natural world can achieve remarkable results, even without modern machines. That knowledge, once gained, must be actively protected if it is to endure. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that we should approach the past with humility rather than condescension. Because every time we dismiss earlier cultures as primitive, we risk overlooking the very real sophistication they developed in ways suited to their world. We risk assuming that if something does not fit our narrative, it must be an error rather than a clue. The maps urge us to slow down, to look again, to ask not just how could they know this, but also what else might we be underestimating. As these questions ripple outward, they begin to touch fields far beyond cartography. They connect to the study of ancient navigation, astronomy, climate shifts, and long-distance trade. They invite collaboration between historians, geographers, mathematicians, and archaeologists. Each discipline adds another layer of understanding, another piece of the puzzle, and still, the mystery never fully disappears. There's always one more detail that does not quite fit, one more coastline that seems oddly familiar, one more note in the margin that hints at an older source now lost. That lingering uncertainty is not a failure of research. It is a reflection of reality. The past is vast, and we are only sampling it in fragments. Perhaps that is why these maps capture the imagination so strongly. They sit at the intersection of evidence and enigma, solid enough to study, mysterious enough to inspire. They allow us to feel the presence of people long gone, people who stood on unfamiliar shores, looked at the tradition that stretches back through countless generations, the effort to map the unknown, to reduce mystery into knowledge, and to pass that knowledge forward. And maybe that is the real thread connecting us to those ancient mapmakers. Not secret technologies or forgotten empires, but shared human drive to understand our place in a vast and complicated world. They work with stars, shadows, and stories. We work with satellites and sensors. But the impulse is the same: to look at the world, to measure it as best we can, and to leave behind a record, hoping someone in the future will pick it up, study it, and continue the journey. And that journey, when you really think about it, has never been about reaching a final destination. It has always been about extending the edge of the known just a little further than the generation before. The ancient cartographers were not trying to solve history's mysteries for us. They were solving the practical problems of their own time, where the currents ran, where the stars rose, where land might lie beyond the horizon. Yet in doing so, they unknowingly left behind evidence of how far human awareness had already stretched. There is something deeply human in that unintended legacy. They were not performing for the future. They were not imagining documentaries, debates, or digital analysis centuries later. They were simply trying to understand their world well enough to move through it. And that is precisely why their work feels so authentic. The lines on those maps are not grand claims. They are working notes from people engaged in the serious business of exploration, trade, and survival. But when those practical documents outlive the systems that produce them, they transform. A navigator's tool becomes a historical riddle. A merchant's reference becomes a scholarly battleground. And in that transformation, we begin to project larger questions onto them. Not just where did they sail, but what kind of world did they believe they were living in? Because every map is also a worldview. Some maps place certain regions at the center, pushing others to the margins. Some enlarge lands of cultural importance and shrink distant territories. Some fill unknown spaces with sea monsters, warnings, or decorative flourishes, signaling not ignorance, but the limits of verified knowledge. The unusual accuracy in certain ancient maps stands out precisely because it breaks from those symbolic traditions. It suggests moments when observation briefly overtook assumption, when information from afar was integrated with surprising precision. And those moments hint at contact, at movement, at networks exchange that carried not just goods, but measurements, stories, and geographic impressions across vast distances. Long before globalization became a modern buzzword, the ancient world was already threaded together in ways we are still uncovering. Amber from the Baltic reached the Mediterranean. Spices from Asia flavored European tables. Ideas traveled with caravans and ships, changing as they went, but never standing still. Maps will have traveled too, not necessarily as finished masterpieces, but as sketches, sailing directions, star paths, and coastal descriptions. One culture might translate another's observations into its own system of measurement. A shoreline described in days of sailing could become a curve on parchment. Over generations, these layered contributions could crystallize into maps that no single culture fully created, but many helped shape. Seen this way, the mystery becomes less about a single lost civilization and more about lost connections. Periods when travel was easier, climates were stable, and trade routes were secure may have allowed knowledge to circulate widely. When those conditions changed, the networks thinned or broke, and the shared picture of the world fragmented. Later societies inherited pieces of that picture, sometimes without knowing how the pieces once fit together. This would explain why certain geographical insights seem to appear, fade, and reappear across history. Knowledge is not just discovered once. It can be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and sometimes misunderstood along the way. A coastline drawn with confidence in one era might be treated as legend in the next, only to be confirmed again centuries later with new voyages. What we are really seeing in these maps is the uneven rhythm of human understanding. Advances do not spread instantly or uniformly. They ripple outward, encounter barriers, and sometimes recede. Geography itself, mountains, deserts, oceans, shapes the flow of information as much as it shapes the flow of rivers and winds. And through it all, there remains a persistent human habit of recording what we learn. That habit may be one of our species' most powerful survival tools. Memory stored outside the mind, in marks on clay, ink on parchment, carvings in stone, allows knowledge to outlive individuals, communities, even entire cultures. The maps are part of that external memory system. They are neurons in a planetary brain, carrying signals forward through time, even when parts of the network go dark. When we lose context, those signals become harder to interpret. A line might represent a shoreline, a trade route, or a mythologized journey. Without supporting texts or traditions, we are left to compare, measure, and infer. Modern technology helps us do this with extraordinary precision, overlaying ancient drawings onto satellite imagery, analyzing distortions, and reconstructing likely projections. But even with all that, there is still interpretation involved. There is still room for debate, and perhaps that is fitting. The maps themselves were a product of interpretation. People translating the three-dimensional, ever-changing Earth into flat, static form. Absolute perfection was never the goal. Usable understanding was. That is a key point often lost in dramatic retellings. The ancient mapmakers did not need centimeter-level accuracy to cross oceans or follow coastlines. They needed relative positions, prevailing directions, and memorable landmarks. Within those practical limits, their achievements could be extraordinary without being magical. The real wonder lies not in impossible precision, but in what careful observation, accumulated over generations, can accomplish. Recognizing that does not make the story less fascinating. It makes it more human, because it reminds us that progress is not built only on sudden breakthroughs. It is built on patience, on countless small corrections, on shared notes passed from hand to hand. The maps embody that slow, collective refinement of knowledge. They are evidence of a long conversation between humans and their environment, carried on across languages and centuries. And that conversation is still happening. Every time a coastline is remeasured due to rising seas, every time a glacier's retreat redraws a boundary, every time a new island forms from volcanic activity, our modern maps change too. The world is not static, and neither is our may turn out to be just another draft in a very long series. That perspective can be unsettling, but it is also grounding. It places us in continuity with all those who came before, navigators watching unfamiliar stars rise over dark seas, scholars copying fading lines by candlelight, travelers describing distant shores to anyone willing to listen. They were not so different from us. They were working with the best tools and information available, trying to make sense of a vast and complex planet. The mystery of the maps, then, is not only about what they show, it is about what they reveal regarding the endurance of human curiosity and cooperation. Across distances that seemed impossible, across eras separated by collapse and renewal, people kept sharing what they knew, not perfectly, not completely, but persistently. And that persistence may be the true reason these ancient lines still speak to us. Because beneath the ink and parchment, beneath the distortions and debates, they carry a quiet, enduring message. Humans have always been explorers of both land and knowledge. We have always tried to push beyond the visible horizon, to compare notes, to build a bigger picture than any one lifetime allows. The maps are simply the physical traces of that effort. Fragile, incomplete, but powerful enough to bridge thousands of years and remind us that the desire to understand our world is one of the oldest and most defining traits we possess. By the time we reach the end of this journey, the maps themselves begin to feel less like objects and more like companions. They have guided us across oceans of uncertainty, through debates and doubts, through bold claims and careful corrections. And as with any long voyage, the final stretch is not about discovering one last dramatic secret. It is about understanding what the journey has truly shown us. Because the greatest revelation hidden in these ancient charts is not a missing continent or forbidden technology. It is a shift in perspective. We started with a simple question. How could people in the distant past have drawn parts of the world with such surprising accuracy? Along the way, we uncovered copying traditions, lost sources, inherited measurements, and the slow accumulation of observational knowledge across generations. We saw how information can travel farther than the cultures that first produced it, and how fragments of understanding can survive long after the systems that created them have faded. In doing so, the mystery transformed. It stopped being a puzzle about impossibility and became a story about continuity. The maps remind us that history is not a straight road illuminated only by modern light. It is a landscape of overlapping paths, some well-documented, others faint but still traceable. Human beings have been observing the skies, the seas, and the land for far longer than our written records suggest. They have been comparing notes, testing routes, and refining their sense of the world with patience and ingenuity. Sometimes that knowledge flourished. Sometimes it fractured, but it was never entirely extinguished. That realization carries both comfort and responsibility. Comfort, because it connects us to a deep lineage of thinkers, travelers, and record keepers. When we examine an ancient coastline sketched in fading ink, we are not looking at the work of strangers from a primitive world. We are looking at distant colleagues in the same long project, trying to understand the planet we inhabit. Their tools were different. Their theories were shaped by their cultures. But their curiosity, their care, and their determination are immediately recognizable. Responsibility, because we now hold a far greater share of the world's knowledge than any generation before us. We map the ocean floor with sonar, chart distant galaxies with space telescopes, and store vast libraries in digital form. Yet the story of the maps warns us that knowledge is never guaranteed to survive on its own. It must be preserved, explained, and passed forward with intention. If the past teaches us anything, it is that loss is always possible. Climate shifts, conflicts, and collapses have erased entire chapters of human understanding before. The ancient chart are proof that even when most is lost, fragments can endure, but they endure best when they are valued, copied, and shared widely. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy of those long-gone mapmakers. Not a hidden message about secret worlds, but a demonstration of what careful observation and shared knowledge can achieve, even under the limitations of their time. They worked without satellites, without global communication, without modern instruments. Yet by pooling experience across journeys and generations, they built pictures of the world that could still surprise us centuries later. That is not a story of mystery alone. It is a story of collaboration stretched across time. As we look at the planet today, interconnected, mapped in astonishing detail, observed from orbit, it is tempting to feel that the age of exploration is over. But in truth, exploration has only changed its scale. We now explore the deep oceans, the polar ice, the microscopic world of cells, and the vast reaches of space. The horizon has moved, but it has not disappeared. And just like those ancient charts, our records will one day become artifacts of history. Future generations may study our maps of coastlines altered by rising seas, our models of climates that have since shifted, our images of forests and reefs that have changed or vanished. They too will piece together who we were, what we knew, and how we saw our world. In that way, the chain continues. The ancient maps are not relics of a lost age of brilliance, nor are they embarrassments to modern science. They are reminders that knowledge is a relay, not a possession. Each generation runs its stretch, adds its refinements, makes its mistakes, and passes the baton forward. Sometimes a handover is smooth. Sometimes it is chaotic. But the race itself has been going on for tens of thousands of years. And so, when we return to those faded lines one last time, we no longer see them as anomalies demanding sensational explanations. We see them as evidence of something both simpler and more profound, that humans have always been trying to understand the world beyond their immediate sight, and have always found ways to share what they learned. That shared effort, imperfect, interrupted, but enduring, is a true map that connects us to the deep past. It stretches from the first travelers who followed coastlines by memory, to the scholars who copied fragile charts by candlelight, to the scientists who now analyze those same lines with digital precision. Across all those eras, the goal has remained remarkably constant: to turn the unknown into the known, and to leave behind a guide for those who come next. The parchment may fade, the ink may crack, the projections may change, but the impulse behind them, the desire to explore, to measure, to understand, and to pass knowledge forward, remains one of the most powerful and defining traits of our species.